Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. You can support the channel on Local, subscribe, star, and buy me a coffee. Today is part 2 of my reading on H P Lovecraft's supernatural horror and literature, beginning at section 5. So without further ado, we shall begin. The aftermath of Gothic fiction. Meanwhile, other hands had not been idle, so that above the dreary plethora of trash like Marquis von Gross's Horrid Mysteries, 1796, Miss Roche's Children of the Abbey, 1796, Miss Darcy's Zepholia or The Moor, 1806, and the poet Shelley's Schoolboy Effusions, Zastorizi, 1810, and St. Irving, 1811, both imitations of Zafloa, there arose many memorable weird works, both in English and German. Classic in merit and markedly different from its fellows because of its foundation in the Oriental tale, rather than the Walpole-esque Gothic novel, is the celebrated History of the Caliph Vathek by the wealthy dilettante William Beckford, first written in the French language but published in an English translation before the appearance of the original. Eastern Tales, introduced to European literature early in the 18th century through Galland's French translation of the inexhaustibly opulent Arabian Nights, had become a reigning fashion, being used both for allegory and for amusement. The sly humor, which only the Eastern mind knows how to mix with weirdness, had captivated a sophisticated generation, till Baghdad and Damascus names became as freely strewn through popular literature as dashing Italian and Spanish ones were soon to be. Beckford, well read in Eastern romance, caught the atmosphere with unusual receptivity, and in his fantastic volume reflected very potently the haughty luxury, sly delusion, bland cruelty, urbane treachery, and shadowy spectral horror of the Saracen spirit. His seasoning of the ridiculous seldom mars the force of his sinister theme, and the tale marches onward with phantasmagoric pomp, in which the laughter is that of skeletons feasting under arabesque domes. Vathek is the tale of the grandson of the Caliph Horan, who, tormented by that ambition for superterrestrial power, pleasure, and learning, which animates the average Gothic villain or Byronic hero, essentially cognate types, is lured by an evil genius to seek the subterranean throne of the mighty and fabulous pre-Adamite sultans in the fiery halls of Eblis, the Mahometan devil. The descriptions of Vathek's palaces and diversions of his scheming sorceress mother Carathis and her witch tower, with the 51-eyed negresses of his pilgrimage to the haunted ruins of Ishtakar, Persepolis, and of the impish bride Norahinar, whom he treacherously acquired on the way of Iskathar's primordial towers, and terraces in the burning moonlight of the waste and of the terrible Cyclopean halls of Eblis, were lured by glittering promises. Each victim is compelled to wander in anguish forever, his right hand upon his blazingly ignited and eternally burning heart, are triumphs of weird coloring which raise the book to a preeminent place in English letters. No less notable are the 3 episodes of Vathek, intended for insertion in the tale as narrative of Vathek's fellow victims in Eblis's infernal halls, which remained unpublished throughout the author's lifetime and were discovered as recently as 1909 by the scholar Lewis Melville whilst collecting material for his life and letters of William Beckford. Beckford, however, lacks the essential mysticism which marks the acutest form of the weird, so that his tales have a certain knowing Latin hardness and clearness preclusive of sheer panic fright. But Beckford remained alone in his devotion to the Orient. Other writers closer to the Gothic tradition and to European life in general were content to follow more faithfully in the lead of Walpole. Among the countless producers of terror literature in the times may be mentioned the utopian economic theorist William Godwin, who followed his famous but non-supernatural Caleb Williams, 1794, with his intendedly weird St. Leon, 1799, in which the theme of the elixir of life, as developed by the imaginary secret order of Rosicrucians, is handled with ingeniousness, if not with atmospheric convincingness. The element of the Rosicrucianism, fostered by a wave of popular magic interest exemplified in the vogue of the charlatan Cagliostro and the publication of Francis Bennett's The Magus, 1801, a curious and compendious treatise on occult principles and ceremonies, of which a reprint was made as lately as 1896. Figures in Bulwer Lytton and in many late Gothic novels, especially that remote and enfeebled posterity, which straggled far down into the 19th century and was represented by George W. M. Reynolds' Faust and the Demon and Wagner the Werewolf. Caleb Williams, though non-supernatural, has many authentic touches of terror. It is the tale of a servant persecuted by a master whom he is found guilty of murder, and displays an invention and skill which have kept it alive in a fashion to this day. It was dramatized as the Iron Chest, and in that form was almost equally celebrated. Godwin, however, was too much the conscious teacher and prosaic man of thought to create a genuine weird masterpiece. His daughter, the wife of Shelley, was much more successful, and in her inimitable Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, 1818, is one of the horror classics of all time. Composed in competition with her husband, Lord Byron, and Dr. John William Polidori, in an effort to prove supremacy in horror making, Miss Shelley's Frankenstein was the only one of the rival narratives to be brought to an elaborate completion. And criticism has failed to prove that the best parts are due to Shelley rather than to her. The novel, somewhat tinged but scarcely marred by moral didacticism, tells of the artificial human being molded from charnel fragments by Victor Frankenstein, a young Swiss medical student. Created by his designer in the mad pride of intellectuality, the monster possesses full intelligence but owns a hideously loathsome form. It is rejected by mankind, becomes embittered, and at length begins the successive murder of all whom young Frankenstein loves best, friends and family. It demands that Frankenstein create a wife for it, and then when the student finally refuses in horror lest the world be populated with such monsters, it departs with a hideous threat to be with him on his wedding night. Upon that night, the bride is strangled, and from that time on, Frankenstein hunts down the monster even into the wastes of the Arctic. In the end, while seeking shelter on the ship of the man who tells the story, Frankenstein himself is killed by the shocking object of his search and creation of his presumptuous pride. Some of the scenes in Frankenstein are unforgettable, as when the newly animated monster enters its creator's room, parts the curtain of his bed, and gazes at him in the yellow moonlight with watery eyes, if eyes they may be called. Miss Shelley wrote other novels, including the fairly notable Last Man, but never duplicated the success of her first effort. It has the true touch of cosmic fear, no matter how much the movement may lag in places. Dr. Polidori developed his competing idea as a long story, The Vampire, in which we behold a suave villain of the Gothic or Byronic style, and encounter some excellent passages of stark fright, including a terrible nocturnal experience and a shunned Grecian wood. In the same period, Sir Walter Scott frequently concerned himself with the weird, weaving it into many of his novels and poems, and sometimes producing such independent bits of narration as the Tapestry Chamber or Wandering Willie's Tale and Red Gauntlet, in the latter of which the force of the spectral and the diabolic is enhanced by a grotesque homeliness of speech and atmosphere. In 1830, Scott published his Letters on Demonology and Witchcraft, which still forms one of our best compendia of European witch lore. Washington Irving is another famous figure not connected with the weird, for though most of his ghosts are too whimsical and humorous to form genuinely spectral literature, a distinct inclination in this direction is to be noted in many of his productions. The German Student in Tales of a Traveler, 1824, is a slyly concise and most effective presentation of the old legend of the dead bride, whilst woven into the comic tissue of the money diggers. In the same volume is more than one hint of piratical apparitions in the realms which Captain Kidd once roamed. Thomas More also joined the ranks of the macabre artists in the poem Eclyphoron, which he later elaborated into the prose of the novel Epicurean, 1827. Though merely relating the adventures of a young Athenian duped by the artifice of cunning Egyptian priests, Moore manages to infuse much genuine horror into the account of subterranean frights and wonders beneath the primordial temples of Memphis. De Quincey more than once revels in grotesque and arabesque terrors. though with a desultoriness and learned pomp which deny him the rank of specialist. This era likewise saw the rise of William Harrison Ainsworth, whose romantic novels teem with the eerie and the gruesome. Captain Marat, besides writing such short tales as The Werewolf, made a memorable contribution in The Phantom Ship, 1839, founded on the legend of the Flying Dutchman whose spectral and accursed vessel sails forever near the Cape of Good Hope. Dickens now raises with occasional weird bits like The Signalman, a tale of ghostly warning conforming to a very common pattern, touched with a vermicilitude which allies it as much with the coming psychological school as with the dying Gothic school. At this time, a wave of interest in spiritualistic charlatanry, mediumism, Hindu theosophy, and such matters much like that of the present day was flourishing, so that the number of weird tales with a psychic or pseudoscientific basis became very considerable. For a number of these prolific and popular, Lord Edward Bulwer-Lytton was responsible. And despite the large doses of turgid rhetoric and empty romanticism in his products, his success and the weaving of a certain kind of bizarre charm cannot be denied. The House in the Brain, which hints of Rosicrucianism and at a malign and deathless figure, perhaps suggested by Louis XV's mysterious courtier, Saint Germain, yet survives as one of the best short haunted house tales ever written. The novel Zanoni, 1842, contains similar elements more elaborately handled and introduces a vast unknown sphere of being pressing on our own world and guarded by a horrible dweller on the threshold who haunts those who try to enter and fail. Here we have a benign brotherhood kept alive from age to age till finally reduced to a single member, and a hero, an ancient Caledonian sorcerer, surviving in the priestly bloom of youth to perish on the guillotine of the French Revolution. Though full of the conventional spirit of romance, marred by a ponderous network of symbolic and didactic meanings, and left unconvincing through lack of perfect atmospheric realization of the situations hinging on the spectral world. Zanoni is really an excellent performance as a romantic novel and can be read with genuine interest today by the not too sophisticated reader. It is amusing to note that in describing an attempted initiation into the ancient brotherhood, the author cannot escape using the stock Gothic castle of Volpolian lineage. In A Strange Story, 1862, Bulwer-Lytton shews a marked improvement in the creation of weird images and moods. The novel, despite enormous length, a highly artificial plot, bolstered up by opportune coincidences and an atmosphere of homiletic pseudoscience designed to please the matter-of-fact and purposeful Victorian reader, is exceedingly effective as a narrative, evoking instantaneous and unflagging interest, and furnishing many potent, if somewhat melodramatic, tableaux and climaxes. Again, we have the mysterious users of life's elixir in the person of the soulless magician Margrave, whose dark exploits stand out with dramatic vividness against the modern background of a quiet English town and of the Australian bush. And again, we have shadowy intimations of a vast spectral world of the unknown and the very air about us, this time handled with much greater power and vitality than in Zanoni. One of the two great incantation passages where the hero is driven by a luminous evil spirit to rise at night in his sleep, take a strange Egyptian wand, and evoke nameless presences in the haunted and mausoleum-facing pavilion of a famous Renaissance alchemist, truly stands among the major terror scenes of literature. Just enough is suggested and just little enough is told. Unknown words are twice detected to the sleepwalker, and as he repeats them, the ground trembles and all the dogs of the countryside begin to bay at half-seen amorphous shadows that stalk athwart the moonlight. When a third set of unknown words is prompted, the sleepwalker's spirit suddenly rebels at uttering them, as if the soul could recognize ultimate abysmal horrors concealed from the mind, and at least an apparition of an absent sweetheart and a good angel break the malign spell. This fragment well illustrates how far Lord Lytton was capable of progressing beyond his usual pomp and stock romance toward the crystalline essence of artistic fear which belongs to the domain of poetry. In describing certain details of incantations, Lytton was greatly indebted to his amusingly serious occult studies, in the course of which he came in touch with that odd French scholar and Kabbalist, Alphonse Louis Constant, Eliphas Levi, who claimed to possess the secrets of ancient magic and to have evoked the specter of the old Grecian wizard Apollonius of Tyana, who lived in Nero's time. The Romantic semi-Gothic quasi-moral tradition here represented was carried far down the 19th century by such authors as Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, Thomas Frescott Prest, with his famous Varney the Vampire, 1847, Wilkie Collins, the late Sir H. Ritter Haggard, where she is remarkably good, Sir A. Carter, Sir A. Conan Doyle, H.G. Wells, and Robert Louis Stevenson, the latter of whom, despite an atrocious tendency towards jaunty mannerisms, created permanent classics in Markheim, The Body Snatcher, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Indeed, we may say that this school still survives, for it clearly belonged such of our contemporary horror tales specialize in events rather than atmospheric details, address the intellect rather than the impressionistic imagination, cultivate a luminous glamour rather than a malign tensity or psychological verisimilitude, and take a definite stand in sympathy with mankind and its welfare. It has its undeniable strength, and because of its human element, commands a wider audience than does the sheer artistic nightmare. If not quite so potent as the latter, it is because a diluted product can never achieve the intensity of the concentrated essence. Quite alone, both as a novel and as a piece of terror literature, stands the famous Wuthering Heights, 1847, by Emily Bronte, with its mad vista of bleak, windswept Yorkshire moors and the violent, distorted lives they foster. Though primarily a tale of life and of human passion and agony and conflict, its especially cosmic setting affords room for horror of the most spiritual sort. Heathcliff, the modified Byronic villain hero, is a strange, dark waif found in the streets as a small child and speaking only a strange gibberish till adapted by the family he ultimately ruins. That he is, in truth, a diabolic spirit rather than a human being is more than once suggested. And the unreal is further approached in the experience of the visitor who encounters a plaintive child ghost at a bow brush upper window. Between Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw is a tie deeper and more terrible than human love. After her death, he twice disturbs her grave and is haunted by an impalpable presence which can be nothing less than her spirit. The spirit enters his life more and more, and at last he becomes confident of some imminent mystical reunion. He says he feels a strange change approaching and ceases to take nourishment. At night, he either walks abroad or opens the casement by his bed. When he dies, the casement is still swinging open to the pouring rain, and a queer smile pervades the stiffened face. They bury him in a grave beside the mound he has haunted for 18 years, and shepherd boys say that he yet walks with his Catherine in the churchyard and on the moor when it rains. Their faces, too, are sometimes seen on rainy nights behind that upper casement at Wuthering Heights. Miss Bronte's eerie terror is no mere Gothic echo, but a tense expression of man's shuddering reaction to the unknown. In this respect, Wuthering Heights becomes the symbol of literary tradition and marks the growth of a new and sounder school. Section 6. Spectral literature on the continent. On the continent, literary horror fared well. The celebrated short tales and novels of Ernst Theodor Wilhelm Hoffmann, 1776 to 1822, are a byword for mellowness of background and maturity of form, though they incline to levity and extravagance, and lack the exalted moments of stark, breathless terror, which a less sophisticated writer might have achieved. Generally, they convey the grotesque rather than the terrible. Most of all, the continental weird tales in the German classic Undine, 1811, by Friedrich Heinrich Karl, Baron de la Motte Folk. In this story of a water spirit who married a mortal and gained a human soul, there is a delicate finesse of craftsmanship which makes it notable in any department of literature, and an easy naturalness which places it close to the genuine folk myth. It is, in fact, derived from a tale told by the Renaissance physician and alchemist Paracelsus in his treatise on elemental spirits. Undine, daughter of a powerful water prince, was exchanged by her father as a small child for a fisherman's daughter in order that she might acquire a soul by wedding a human being. Meeting the noble youth Huldbrand at the cottage of her foster father by the sea at the edge of a haunted wood, she soon marries him. and accompanies him to his ancestral castle of Ringstetten. Huldbrand, however, eventually wearies of his wife's supernatural afflictions and especially of the appearances of her uncle, the malicious woodland water spirit Kuleborn, a weariness increased by his growing affection for Bertalda, who turns out to be the fisherman's child for whom Undine was exchanged. At length, on a voyage down the Danube, he is provoked by some innocent act of his devoted wife to utter the angry words which consign her back to her supernatural element, from which she can, by the laws of her species, return only once to kill him, whether she will or no, if ever he prove unfaithful to her memory. Later, when Huldbrand is about to be married to Bertalda, Undine returns for her sad duty and bears his life away in tears. When he is buried among his fathers in the village churchyard, a veiled, snow-white female figure appears among the mourners, but after the prayer is seen no more. In her place is seen a little silver spring, which murmurs its way almost completely around the new grave and empties into a neighboring lake. The villagers shew it to this day and say that Undine and her Huldbrand are thus united in death. Many passages and atmospheric touches in the tale reveal Folk as an accomplished artist in the field of the macabre, especially the depictions of the haunted wood with its gigantic snow-white man and various unnamed terrors which occur early in the narrative. Not so well known as Undine, but remarkable for its convincing realism and freedom from Gothic stock devices, is the Amber Witch, or Wilhelm Meinhold, another product of the German fantastic genius of the early 19th century. This tale, which is laid in the time of the 30 Years' War, purports to be a clergyman's manuscript found in a church at Koserow and centers around the writer's daughter, Maria Schwalder, who was wrongly accused of witchcraft. She has found a deposit of amber which she keeps secret for various reasons, and the unexplained wealth obtained from this lends color to the accusation. An accusation instigated by the malice of the wolf-hunting nobleman Wittich Appelman, who has vainly pursued her with ignoble designs. The deeds of a real witch, who afterward comes to a horrible supernatural end in prison, are glibly imputed to the hapless Maria, and after a typical witchcraft trial with forced confessions under torture, she is about to be burned at the stake, when saved just in time by her lover, a noble youth from a neighboring district. Meinhold's great strength is in his air of casual and realistic verisimilitude, which intensifies our suspense and sense of the unseen by half persuading us that the menacing events must somehow be either in truth or very close to the truth. Indeed, so thorough is this realism that a popular magazine once published the main points of the Amber Witch as an actual occurrence of the 17th century. In the present generation, German horror fiction is most notably present by Hans Heinz Ewers, who brought to bear on his dark conceptions and effective knowledge of modern psychology. Novels like The Sorcerer's Apprentice and Oleron and short stories like The Spider contain distinctive qualities which rise them to a classic level. But France, as well as Germany, has been active in the realm of weirdness. Victor Hugo, in such tales as Hans of Iceland and Balzac and The Wild Ass's Skin, Seraphita and Louis Lambert both employ supernaturalism to a greater or lesser extent, though generally only as a means to some more human end, and without the sincere and demoniac intensity which characterized the born artist in Shadows. It is the Théophile Gautier that we first seem to find an authentic French sense of the unreal world. And here there appears the spectral mastery which, though not continuously used, is recognized at once as something alike genuine and profound. Short tales like Avatar, The Foot of the Mummy, and Clairemont display glimpses of forbidden vistas that allure, tantalize, and sometimes horrify, whilst the Egyptian visions evoked in one of Cleopatra's Nights are of the keenest and most expressive potency. Gautier captured the inmost soul of aeon-weighted Egypt, with its cryptic life and cyclopean architecture, and uttered once and for all the elemental horror of its netherworld of catacombs, where to the end of time millions of stiff, spiced corpses will stare up in the blackness with glassy eyes, waiting some awesome and unrelatable summons. Gustave Flaubert ably continued the tradition of Gautier in orgies of poetic fantasy like The Temptation of St. Anthony. And but for a strong realistic bias, might have been an arch-weaver of tapestried horrors. Later on, we see the stream divide, producing strange poets and fantasticities of the symbolist and decadent schools whose dark interests really center more in abnormalities of human thought and instinct than in the actual supernatural, and subtle storytellers whose thrills are quite directly derived from the night black wells of cosmic unreality. Of the former class of artists in sin, the illustrious poet Baudelaire, influenced vastly by Poe, is the supreme type. With the psychological novelist Joris Karl Huysmans, a true child of the 1890s, is at once the summation and finale. The latter and purely narrative class is continued by Prosper Mérimée, whose Venus of Ely presents in terse and convincing prose the same ancient statue bride theme which Thomas More cast in form in The Ring. The horror tales of the powerful and cynical Guy de Maupassant, written as his final madness gradually overtook him, present individualities of their own, being rather the morbid outpourings of a realistic mind in a pathological state than the healthy imaginative products of a vision naturally disposed toward fantasy and sensitive to the normal illusions of the unseen. Nevertheless, they are of the keenest interest and poignancy, suggesting with marvelous force the imminence of nameless terrors and the relentless dodging of an ill-starred individual by hideous and menacing representatives of the outer blackness. Of these stories, the Horla is generally regarded as the masterpiece, relating the advent to France of an invisible being who lives on water and milk, sways the minds of others, and seems to be the vanguard of a horde of extraterrestrial organisms arriving on Earth to subjugate and overwhelm mankind. This tense narrative is perhaps without peer in its particular department, notwithstanding its indebtedness to a tale by the American Fritz James O'Brien for details in describing the actual presence of the unseen monster. Other potently dark creations of de Maupassant are Who Knows, The Spectre, He, The Diary of a Madman, The White Wolf, On the River, and the grisly verses entitled Horror. The collaborators Erckmann Chatrain enriched French literature with many spectral fancies like The Wolfman, in which a transmuted curse works towards its end in a traditional Gothic castle setting. Their power of creating a shuddering midnight atmosphere was tremendous despite a tendency toward natural explanations and scientific wonders. And few short tales contain greater horror than The Invisible Eye, where a malignant old hag weaves nocturnal hypnotic spells which induce the successive occupants of a certain inn chamber to hang themselves on a crossbeam. The Owl's Ear and The Waters of Death are full of engulfing darkness and mystery, the latter embodying the familiar overgrown spider theme so frequently employed by weird fictionists. Valir de Iliadum likewise followed the macabre school, his Tortured by Hope, the tale of a state-condemned prisoner, harrowing short story in literature, permitted to escape in order to feel the pangs of recapture, being held by some to constitute the most harrowing short story in literature. This type, however, is less a part of the weird tradition than a class particular to itself, the so-called conte cruel, in which the wrenching of the emotions is accompanied through dramatic tantalizations, frustrations, and gruesome physical horrors. Almost wholly devoted to this form is the living writer Maurice Lavelle, whose very brief episodes have lent themselves so readily to theatrical adaptation and the thrillers of the Grand Guignol. As a matter of fact, the French genius is more naturally suited to the dark realism of the suggestion of the unseen, since the latter process requires for its best and most sympathetic development on a large scale the inherent mysticism of the northern mind. A very flourishing, though till recently quite hidden branch of weird literature is that of the Jews, kept alive and nourished in obscurity by the somber heritage of early Eastern magic, apocalyptic literature, and Kabbalism. The Semitic mind, like the Celtic and Teutonic, seems to possess marked mystical inclinations, and the wealth of the underground horror lore surviving in ghettos and synagogues must be much more considerable than is generally imagined. Kabbalism itself, so prominent during the Middle Ages, is a system of philosophy explaining the universe as emanations of the deity and involving the existence of strange spiritual realms and beings apart from the visible world, of which dark glimpses may be obtained through certain secret incantations. Its ritual is bound up with mystical interpretations of the Old Testament and attributes an esoteric significance to each letter of the Hebrew alphabet, a circumstance which has imparted to Hebrew letters a sort of spectral glamour and potency in the popular literature of magic. Jewish folklore has preserved much of the terror and mystery of the past, and when more thoroughly studied is likely to exert considerable influence on weird fiction. The best examples of its literary use so far are the German novel The Golem by Gustav Meinrich and the drama De Book by the Jewish writer using the pseudonym Ansky. The former, with its haunting, shadowy suggestions of marvels and horrors just beyond reach, is laid in Prague and describes with singular mastery that city's ancient ghetto with its spectral peaked gables. The name is derived from a fabulous artificial giant supposed to be made and animated by medieval rabbis, according to a certain cryptical formula. The De Book, translated and produced in America in 1925 and more recently produced as an opera, describes with singular power the possession of a living body by an evil soul of a dead man. Both golems and De Books are fixed types and serve as frequent ingredients of later Jewish tradition. Part 7. Edgar Allan Poe. In the 1830s occurred a literary dawn directly affected not only the history of the weird tale, but that of short fiction as a whole, and indirectly molded the trends and fortunes of a great European aesthetic school. It is our good fortune as Americans to be able to claim that dawn as our own, for it came in the person of our illustrious and unfortunate fellow countryman Edgar Allan Poe. Poe's fame has been subject to curious undulations, and it is now a fashion among the advanced intelligentsia to minimize his importance, both as an artist and as an influence. But it would be hard for any mature and reflective critic to deny the tremendous value of his work and the pervasive potency of his mind as an opener of artistic vistas. True, his type of outlook may have been anticipated, but it was he who first realized its possibilities and gave it supreme form and systemic expression. True also that subsequent writers may have produced greater single tales than his, but again we must comprehend that it was only he who taught them by example and precept the art which they have the way cleared for them, and given an explicit guide were perhaps able to carry to greater lengths. Whatever his limitations, Poe did that which no one else ever did or could have done, and we owe to him the modern horror story in its final and perfected state. Before Poe, the bulk of weird writers had worked largely in the dark, without an understanding of the psychological basis of horror and hampered by more or less of conformity to certain empty literary conventions, such as the happy ending, virtue rewarded, and in general a hollow moral didacticism, acceptance of popular standards and values, and striving of the author to obtrude his own emotions in the story and take sides with the partisans of the majority's artificial ideas. Poe, on the other hand, perceived the essential impersonality of the real artist and knew that the function of creative fiction is merely to express and interpret events and sensations as they are, regardless of how they tend or what they prove, good or evil, attractive or repulsive, stimulating or depressing. With the author always acting as a vivid and detached chronicler rather than as a teacher, sympathizer, or vendor of opinion. He saw clearly that all phases of life and thought are equally eligible as subject matter for this artist, and being inclined by temperament to strangeness and gloom, decided to be the interpreter of these powerful feeling and frequent happy endings which attend pain rather than pleasure, decay rather than growth, terror rather than tranquility, and which are fundamentally either adverse or indifferent to the tastes and traditional outward sentiments of mankind, and to the health, sanity, and normal expansive welfare of the species. Poe's specters thus acquired a convincing malignity possessed by none of his predecessors, and established a new standard of realism in the annals of literary horror. The impersonal and artistic intent, moreover, was aided by a scientific attitude not often found before, whereby Poe studied the human mind rather than the usages of Gothic fiction, and wrote with an analytical knowledge of terror's true sources, which doubled the force of his narratives and emancipated him from all the absurdities inherent in a merely conventional shudder coining. This example having been set, later authors were naturally forced to conform it to it in order to complete it all, so that in this way a definite change began to affect the mainstream of macabre writing. Poe too set a fashion in consummate craftsmanship, and although today some of his own work seems slightly melodramatic and unsophisticated, we can constantly trace his influence in such things as the maintenance of a single mood and an achievement of a single impression in a tale, and the rigorous paring down of incidents to such as have a direct bearing on the plot and will figure prominently in the climax. Truly may it be said that Poe invented the short story in its present form. His elevation of disease, perversity, and decay to the level of artistically expressible themes was likewise infinitely far-reaching in effect, for avidly seized, sponsored, and intensified by his eminent French admirer, Charles Pierre Baudelaire, it became the nucleus of the principal aesthetic movements in France, thus making Poe, in a sense, the father of the decadents and the symbolists. Poet and critic by nature and supreme attainment, logician and philosopher by taste and mannerism, Poe was by no means immune from defects and affectations. His pretense to profound and obscure scholarship, his blundering ventures in stilted and labored pseudo-humor, and his often vitriolic outbursts of critical prejudice must all be recognized and forgiven. Beyond and above them, and dwarfing them to insignificance, was a master's vision of the terror that stalks about and within us, and the worm that writhes and slavers in the hideously close abyss, penetrating to every festering horror in the gaily painted mockery called existence, and in the solemn masquerade called human thought and feelings. That vision had power to project itself in blackly magical crystallizations and transmutations, till there bloomed in the sterile America of the 30s and 40s such a moon-nourishing garden of gorgeous poisonous fungi as not even the nether slope of Saturn might boast. Verses and tales alike sustain the burthen of cosmic pain. The raven, whose noisome beak pierces the heart, the ghoul that toll iron bells and pestilential steeples, the vault of Yulimum in the black October night, the shocking spires and domes under the sea, the wild, weird climb that lieth sublime out of space, out of time. All these things and more leer at us amidst maniacal rattlings and the seething nightmare of the poetry. And in the prose, there yawn open for us the very jaws of the pit, inconceivable abnormalities slyly hinted into a horrible half-knowledge by words whose innocence we scarcely doubt, till the cracked tension of the speaker's hollow voice bids us fear their nameless implications, demoniac patterns and presences slumbering noxiously till waked for one phobic instant into a shrieking revelation that cackles itself to sudden madness or explodes in memorable and cataclysmic echoes. A witch's Sabbath of horror fling off decorous robes is flashed before us, a sight the more monstrous because of the scientific skill with which every particular is marshaled and brought into an easy, apparent relation to their known gruesomeness of material life. Poe's tales, of course, fall into several classes, some of which contain a purer essence of spiritual horror than others. The tales of logic and ratiocination, forerunners of modern detective story, are not to be included at all in the weird literature, while certain others, probably influenced considerably by Hoffman, possess an extravagance which relegates them to the borderline of the grotesque. Still, a third deal with abnormal psychology and monomania in such a way as to express terror but not weirdness. A substantial residuum, however, represent the literature of supernatural horror in its acutest form, and give their author a permanent and unassailable place as deity and fountainhead of all modern diabolic fiction. Who can forget the terrible swollen ship poised on the billow chasm edge in MS, found in a bottle, the dark intimations of her unhallowed age and monstrous growth, her sinister crew of unseen graybeards, and her frightful southward rush under full sail through the ice of the Antarctic night, sucked onward by some resistless devil current toward a vortex of eldritch enlightenment which must end in destruction. Then there is the unutterable M. Valdemar, kept together by hypnotism for several months after his death and uttering frantic sounds but a moment before the breaking of the spell, leaves him a nearly liquid mass of loathsome, of detestable putrescence. In the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, the voyagers reach first a strange South Polar land of murderous savages where nothing is white, and where vast rocky ravines have the form of titanic Egyptian letters spelling terrible primal arcana of Earth. And thereafter a still more mysterious realm where everything is white, and where shrouded giants and snowy plumed birds guard a vast cataract of mist which empties from immeasurable celestial heights into a torrid, milky sea. Metz Engerstein horrifies with its malign hints of a monstrous metempsychosis. The mad nobleman who burns the stable of his hereditary foe, the colossal unknown horse that issues from the blazing building after the owner has perished therein, the vanishing bit of ancient tapestry where was shown the giant horse of the victim's ancestor in the Crusades, the madman's wild and constant riding of the great horse, and his fear and hatred of the steed, the meaningless prophecies that brood obscurely over the warring houses, and finally the burning of the madman's palace, and the death therein of the owner, borne helpless into the flames and up the vast staircase, astride the beast he was ridden so strangely. Afterward, the rising smoke of the ruins takes the form of a gigantic horse, the man of the crowd, telling of one who roams day and night to mingle with streams of people as if afraid to be alone, has quieter effects but implies nothing less of cosmic fear. Poe's mind was never far from terror and decay, and we see in every tale, poem, and philosophical dialogue a tense eagerness to fathom unplumbed wells of night, to pierce the veil of death, and to reign in fancy as the lord of the frightful mysteries of time and space. Certain of Poe's tales possess an almost absolute perfection of artistic form, which makes them veritable beacon lights in the province of the short story. Poe could, when he wished, give to his prose a richly poetic cast, employing that archaic and orientalized style with jeweled phrase, quasi-biblical repetition, and recurrent burthen so successfully used by later writers like Oscar Wilde and Lord Dunsany. And in the cases where he has done this, we have an effect of lyrical fantasy, almost narcotic in essence, an opium pageant of dream in the language of dream, with every unnatural color and grotesque image bodied forth in a symphony of corresponding sound. The Marquis of the Red Death, Silence a Fable, and Shadow a Parable are assuredly poems in every sense of the word, save the metrical one, and owe as much of their power to oral cadence as to the visual imagery. But it is in two of the less openly poetic tales, Ligeia and The Fall of the House of Usher, especially the latter, that one finds those very summits of artistry whereby Poe takes his place at the head of fictional miniaturists. Simple and straightforward in plot, both of these tales owe their supreme magic to the cunning development which appears in the selection and collection of every least incident. Ligeia tells of a first wife of lofty and mysterious origin who, after death, returns through a preternatural force of will to take possession of the body of a second wife, imposing even her physical appearance on the temporary reanimated corpse of her victim at the last moment. Despite a suspicion of prolixity and top-heaviness, the narrative reaches its terrific climax with relentless power. Usher, whose superiority in detail and proportion is very marked, hints shudderingly of obscure life and inorganic things, and displays an abnormally linked trinity of entities at the end of the long and isolated family history: a brother, his twin sister, and their incredibly ancient house, all sharing a single soul and meeting one common dissolution at the same moment. These bizarre conceptions, so awkward and unskilled hands, become under Poe spell-leveling, living and convincing terrors to haunt our nights, and all because the author understood so perfectly the very mechanics and psychology of fear and strangeness. The essential details to emphasize, the precise incongruities and conceits to select as preliminaries or concomitants to horror, the exact incidents and allusions to throw out innocently in advance as symbols or prefigurings of each major step toward the hideous denouement to come. The nice adjustments of cumulative force and the unnerving accuracy and linkage of parts, which makes for faultless unity throughout, and thunderous effectiveness at the climactic moment. The delicate nuances of scenic and landscape value to select and establishing and sustaining the desired mood, and vitalizing the desired illusion, principles of this kind and dozens of obscure ones, elusive to be described or even fully comprehended by any ordinary commentator. Melodrama and unsophistication there may be, but we are told of one fastidious Frenchman who could not bear to read Poe except in Baudrillard's urbane and gallically modulated translation. But all traces of such things are wholly overshadowed by a potent inborn sense of the spectral, the morbid, and the horrible, which gushed forth from every cell of the artist's creative mentality and stamped his macabre work with the ineffectible mark of supreme genius. Poe's weird tales are alive in a manner that few others could ever hope to be. Like most fantasies, Poe excels in incidents and broad narrative effect rather than in character drawing. His typical protagonist is generally a dark, handsome, proud, melancholy intellectual, highly sensitive, capricious, introspective, isolated, and sometimes slightly mad gentleman of ancient family and opulent circumstances. Usually deeply learned in a strange lore and darkly ambitious of penetrating to forbidden secrets of the universe. Aside from a high-sounding name, this character obviously derives from the early Gothic novel, for he is clearly neither the wooden hero nor the diabolic villain of Radcliffean or Ludovician romance. Indirectly, however, he does possess a sort of genealogical connection, since his gloomy, ambitious, and antisocial qualities savor strongly of the typical Byronic hero, who in turn is definitely an offspring of the Gothic Manfreds, Montanus, and Ambrosius. Moreover, particular qualities appear to be derived from the psychology of Poe himself, who certainly possessed much of the depression, sensitiveness, mad aspiration, loneliness, and extravagant freakishness which he attributes to his haughty and solitary victims of fate. All right, we will end here at part 8, The Weird Tradition in America. Right, everyone, tune in next week for part 3 of my reading of supernatural horror and literature by H P Lovecraft. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.